The storm came without warning, a white wall swallowing the mountains of New Mexico. Ethan McCord leaned into the wind, his coat heavy with frost, his boots crunching through snow that reached his knees. He had meant only to check the barn doors, to be certain the animals would not freeze. But what he found lying in the drift made his heart lurch against his ribs. 3 figures. Still. Silent. Apache girls. No older than the daughters he once buried. Their dark hair was tangled with ice, their skin pale beneath the streaks of blood soaking their clothes. For a moment, Ethan thought they were corpses, left behind by men cruel enough to abandon the wounded. Then one of them moved just a flicker, a hand trembling weakly against the snow. Ethan stood frozen. He had sworn to keep to himself, to let the world pass him by. But in the blue shadows of that storm, he could not turn away. With a curse that was half prayer, he bent down, hooked his arms beneath the nearest girl, and began dragging her toward the glow of his cabin light. Inside, he would bleed and fight beside them, even if it meant losing what little place he had in this land. Because no man who had once loved a family could leave another to die in the snow. Before we follow Ethan's choice and the story that began with that storm, leave us a comment and tell us where you are listening from tonight. And if you believe in these Wild West love stories, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next tale of courage and redemption. Ethan staggered through the doorway, the first girl limp in his arms. The storm slammed the cabin walls like a giant's fist. He laid her near the hearth, then turned back into the white fury for the second, then the third. By the time the last body thudded onto his floorboards, his lungs burned and his hands shook from the cold. Blood. Too much of it. Ethan's eyes went to the youngest Tiva. He would later learn her name, her chest rising in shallow, broken gasps. The others weren't much better. One had a shoulder ripped open by a bullet, the other a leg wound dark with frost and clotting. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had stitched horses. He had cut out rot from cattle. But this was human. His hands moved anyway. He stoked the fire higher, boiled water, poured whiskey over the knife's edge. The smell filled the cabin, sharp and bitter. He pressed the blade in, searching for the lead buried in torn flesh. The girl jerked even unconscious, a strangled cry escaping her lips. Ethan whispered low, as if to his lost child, "Hold on, don't leave me now." Minutes blurred into hours. Sweat dripped from his brow, though the storm screamed outside. One by one, he pulled the bullets free, dropped them into a tin cup, and bound the wounds with rags torn from his own shirts. His cabin floor was streaked red, but the faint rhythm of breath told him he had not failed, at least not yet. Exhausted, Ethan slumped against the wall, staring at the 3 fragile lives lined before his fire. He didn't know their names, their stories, or why fate had thrown them onto his land. All he knew was that, for the first time in years, he was no longer alone in the storm. Dawn crept pale through the cracks of the shutters, painting the cabin in gray light. Ethan woke in his chair, his body stiff, the tin cup of bloody bullets still on the table beside him. For a moment, he thought it had been a nightmare. The storm, the girls, the endless hours of stitching. Then he heard it, the faint rasp of breathing, steady now, not broken. He rose slowly, joints aching, and knelt beside the hearth. The 3 girls lay beneath blankets, faces drawn, but alive. The eldest stirred first, her dark lashes fluttering open. Her gaze, black as obsidian, darted to him with the wild panic of a trapped animal. Ethan lifted his hands, palms open. "Easy, you're safe." She tried to speak, but only a dry croak came. Ethan poured water into a tin cup and held it to her lips. She drank, then slumped back, still watching him as if waiting for the blow that never came. The second girl shifted, wincing at the pull of stitches in her thigh. Ethan steadied her with a hand, surprised at how small and fragile her arm felt beneath his calloused fingers. The youngest Tiva, he thought, slept on, her chest rising shallow, but stronger than the night before. He sat back, exhaling. Relief washed over him, sharper than whiskey. Against all odds, they had survived the storm and his crude hands. Yet as he looked at them, he felt a weight settle deeper in his chest. 3 wounded Apache girls in his cabin. If the town learned of this, they would call it sin, treachery, worse. Still, Ethan knew one truth, as certain as the fire's crackle. He could not send them back to the snow. Not now, not ever. The storm had passed, leaving the cabin wrapped in a brittle silence. Outside, the drifts lay high against the fence, white and merciless. Inside, Ethan tended the fire, his eyes heavy with weariness. He had meant only to check their wounds, to be certain the stitches held. But as he leaned close, the eldest stirred again. Her lips moved, whispers breaking through cracked breath. Names in Apache, soft and trembling, like prayers. Ethan didn't know the words, yet he understood. She was calling for family that would never answer. A chill swept through him, sharper than the wind beyond the walls. His own daughter's voice rose in his memory, Lucy, crying for him the night the fever took her. He had sat by her bed just as he sat here now, helpless, listening to a life slip away. His wife's face followed, pale and still, buried beneath the red soil at dawn. He forced the memories back, but they clung, bitter as ash. He had built these walls to keep the world out, to keep grief buried. Now 3 broken strangers had dragged it all to the surface again. The second girl whimpered in her sleep, clutching at her thigh. Ethan laid a steady hand against the blanket, the gesture awkward but meant to comfort. She quieted, and for a moment, the cabin seemed to breathe with him. He stared into the flames, jaw tight. He had not asked for this burden. Yet, as the echoes of the girls' voices faded into the crackle of firewood, Ethan knew their ghosts and his own were not so different. And perhaps saving them was the only way he might save himself. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Ethan had not known in years. The storm eased, though snow still lay deep against the barn, and for the first time since winter had seized the land, the cabin breathed with more than his solitude. Each morning, he checked their wounds. His stitches held, crude but strong. The eldest, whom he learned was called Ahioka, moved stiffly but with a fire in her eyes that unsettled him. She tried to rise too soon, grimacing as her shoulder pulled against the bandages. Ethan muttered under his breath, pressing her back down. "Foolish girl, you'll tear it open again." She did not understand the words, perhaps, but her glare was sharp enough to make him step back. The second, Nayeli, was quieter. She limped when she tried to fetch water, though Ethan scolded her for it. Still, she insisted, her hands gentle as she took the tin bucket. There was something in her calmness that reminded him of his wife, the same soft defiance, the same quiet strength that held a household together. The youngest, Tiva, recovered slowly. Her breaths were shallow, her body frail, yet when the firelight touched her face, she sometimes smiled. A fleeting thing, but enough to twist Ethan's chest. She would sit near the hearth, humming a tune so faint he could almost believe it was Lucy again, singing in the twilight. One evening, as Ethan chopped firewood outside, he heard a sound that stopped him cold. Laughter. Not the rough chuckle of ranch hands around a bottle, but high, unguarded laughter. He dropped the axe, heart pounding, and stepped back inside. The sight startled him more than the blizzard had. The 3 girls huddled near the fire, sharing some private joke. Ahioka had managed to balance Daniel's old wooden horse carved years ago, long forgotten, on the edge of a stool. It toppled, and Tiva giggled, clutching her side. Even Nayeli laughed, low and musical, her hand covering her mouth as if ashamed of the sound. Ethan stood in the doorway, snow melting from his coat, unable to move. The cabin had been a tomb for so long that he had almost forgotten what it meant for walls to echo with joy. For a moment, the years of silence cracked apart, and light spilled through. But as quickly as it came, the warmth burned his throat. He turned sharply, hanging his coat by the door, muttering about chores. The girls fell quiet, watching him with unreadable eyes. He busied himself at the table, though every nerve in him ached with the memory of laughter that was not his to keep. That night, when the girls finally slept, Ethan sat alone by the fire. The wooden horse lay on the floor where it had fallen. He picked it up, turning it in his hands. The carving was rough, uneven, his clumsy attempt for Lucy's 6th birthday. He had never thought it would outlive her. Now it had made 3 strangers laugh. Ethan set it gently on the mantel. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, or how long these girls would remain beneath his roof. But tonight, the cabin was no longer a place of ghosts. Tonight, It was alive. And though he would never admit it aloud, Ethan McCord felt the faintest trace of something he thought had died with his family hope. By the second week, the snow had thinned enough for Ethan to saddle his mare and ride into Cold Creek. Supplies were running low. The girls had done what they could stretching the beans, boiling the last strips of jerky into thin broth, but he knew the shelves would soon be bare. He told himself the trip was just another chore, nothing more. Yet as the town came into sight, a knot tightened in his gut. Cold Creek was small, one dusty street lined with wooden buildings, church steeple rising sharp against the sky. Ethan swung down outside Harlan's store, the same as he had done 100 times before. But when he pushed through the door, the air shifted. Two women near the counter went quiet, their eyes sliding toward him, then quickly away. Mr. Harlan himself came forward, a sack of flour in hand. "McCord," he said, voice dry as kindling. "Heard you been busy up at that ranch of yours." Ethan frowned. "Need flour, salt, coffee, same as usual." Harlan set the sack on the counter, slow, deliberate. "Folks talk, you know. Said you pulled 3 Apache girls out of the snow. Said they're living under your roof." His gaze sharpened. "That true?" Ethan's jaw worked. He could have lied, could have muttered something about hired hands passing through. But the image of the girls, Tiva's weak smile, Nayeli's steady hands, Ahioka's fierce eyes rose in him like a shield. "They're alive because I found them," he said flatly. "That's all anyone needs to know." The women by the shelves whispered louder now, their words like nettles. Sin, shame, dangerous. One even crossed herself. Harlan pushed the flour across the counter but didn't add the coffee. "Cash only. And don't expect the pastor to look kindly on this." Ethan slammed down his coins, scooped up the sack, and stalked outside. The street seemed narrower than before, the faces harder. He felt every eye on his back as he mounted up, as though he'd grown horns. By the time he returned to the ranch, the weight of their stares still clung to him like smoke. Ahioka met him at the door, eyes questioning. He said nothing, only set the flour on the table. But when he turned away, he caught the flicker of fear in her gaze. She knew. Somehow, she knew the danger was not gone. That night, as the girls slept, Ethan sat alone by the fire. The cabin walls no longer felt safe. Cold Creek had always tolerated him a widower, a loner, odd but harmless. Now he was something else, a man with Apache women in his home. To them, that was scandal, sin, even treachery. He stared into the flames, the old grief stirring with new fury. He had saved lives. Was that a crime? His fists tightened on his knees. He told himself he didn't care what they thought. But in the silence of the cabin, with the storm gone and the night too clear, Ethan McCord felt the first real shadow of war gathering, not from nature this time, but from men. The days after his return from Cold Creek were heavier than the snow still clinging to the mountains. Ethan McCord worked harder than ever, splitting logs, mending fence posts, hauling water from the half-frozen creek, but no matter how many chores he piled upon himself, the words from Harlan's mouth clung like burrs. Sin, shame, dangerous. He caught himself studying the girls when they thought he wasn't looking. Ahioka, the eldest, had taken to following him outdoors, her wounded shoulders stiff but her eyes sharp, wary. She moved with the bearing of someone who refused pity. Ethan respected it, though her presence was a constant reminder of the choice he had made. Nayeli stayed close to the hearth, sewing with quiet focus, patching his old shirts with stitches finer than he ever managed. The youngest, Tiva, still weak, hummed softly as she worked at small tasks, her fragile voice filling the silences that used to feel endless. Ethan told himself their laughter was dangerous. Their soft chatter at night, when they thought him asleep, it would only dig him deeper into the grave the town was already digging for him. And yet, each sound filled the cabin with a warmth he hadn't felt since before Lucy's fever had taken her, before he buried his wife at the edge of the cottonwoods. One evening, he sat sharpening his knife by the fire. The rhythm was steady, scraping steel on stone. The girls were gathered on the floor, sharing a strip of jerky between them, their heads close together. They looked up at him, just once, and he saw something unspoken pass among them. Trust. It landed heavy in his chest. His hand froze on the blade. You fool, he thought. They're not your family. They never can be. That night, unable to sleep, he pulled on his coat and stepped into the bitter cold. The stars burned sharp above. The land stretched white and merciless. He led his mare from the barn, fingers brushing the worn leather of the saddle. The thought had grown in him like a thorn. If he took them away now, rode them across the ridges, left them near their people, maybe he could be free of this burden before Cold Creek made good on its threats. But as he stood there, breath steaming in the night, the door creaked behind him. A thin figure leaned against the frame. Tiva. Her blanket slipped from her shoulders, hair dark against the snow's glow. She looked small, so small, but her eyes found his. She didn't speak, only coughed softly, her hand pressed to her chest. Ethan's throat tightened. He could almost hear Lucy's voice again, weak and fevered, calling Papa. He dropped the reins. The mare stamped, restless in the frost. Ethan turned, scooped Tiva into his arms, and carried her back inside. She clung to him with surprising strength, as if she knew he had almost walked away. Laying her by the fire, he sat beside her until her breathing steadied. Nayeli stirred, glancing at him with a question in her eyes. He only shook his head, unable to trust his voice. When the cabin grew quiet again, Ethan stared at the flames, the knife still sheathed at his belt. He knew the truth now, as sharp and unforgiving as any blade. He could not abandon them. Not Ahioka with her fierce defiance. Not Nayeli with her steady hands. Not Tiva with her fragile song. They had carved themselves into the silence he once called his life. And no matter what Cold Creek thought, no matter the cost, Ethan McCord would not let them go. The snow melted in slow rivulets down the slopes, though patches of white still clung stubbornly in the shadows of the pines. Winter had loosened its grip, but Ethan McCord felt no relief. The weight pressing his chest was heavier than any storm. He had tried, truly tried to keep his distance, to remind himself that the three girls under his roof were strangers, nothing more. But each day eroded that wall. Ahioka's fierce eyes followed him as he chopped wood, as if daring him to falter. Nayeli's quiet hands mended his shirts, kneaded dough, even tucked a blanket over his shoulders one evening when he dozed by the fire. And Tiva fragile Tiva hummed songs at dusk that slipped through the cracks in his armor like light. They had filled the silence. And worse, they had filled the emptiness. Ethan told himself he was no fool. He knew the talk in Cold Creek. When he'd ridden in for supplies, the whispers had curled around him like smoke. Apache horse. Shame. Corruption. He had heard it all before. In other words, with other names. He had heard it when his wife married a man beneath her station, when his daughter died, and they called it God's judgment. Cold Creek had always needed someone to cast out, and now, with him sheltering three girls who bore the wrong blood, they had found their scapegoat. One morning, as he worked in the barn, he heard footsteps crunch behind him. Ahioka stood there, her shoulders still bound, but her chin high. She spoke in halting English, words clipped and uncertain. You? Send us away? The question hit harder than any blow. Ethan gripped the haft of his axe, staring at the scarred wood beneath his boots. He wanted to answer quick, to say yes, to end this before it unraveled further. But when he lifted his gaze, he saw the others standing in the doorway. Nayeli with her calm eyes, Tiva leaning weakly against her arm. Three pairs of eyes, waiting, hoping. He set the axe aside. No, he said, voice rough. I don't send you away. Ahioka's eyes narrowed, searching for lies. Nayeli's shoulders eased, just a fraction. Tiva smiled faintly, and the sight struck him like sunlight after a long night. That evening, Ethan sat by the fire long after they had gone to sleep. He stared at the tin cup on the mantel, the bullets he had pulled from their bodies. Tokens of fate, reminders of how easily he could have walked away. But he hadn't, and now the choice was made. He was not a man of speeches, not a man of scripture. But in the quiet crackle of the flames, Ethan made a vow not to God, not to Cold Creek, but to himself. They are mine to protect now. Mine to keep alive, whatever it costs. The days turned hard again, not from weather, but from tension. Word reached him through an old neighbor who rode by with cattle. The pastor had spoken of him in church, condemning his immoral household. Some of the men muttered about riding out to set things right. Ethan only nodded, jaw tight, thanking the man before returning to his chores. But inside, he was already preparing. He repaired the barn door, reinforced the hinges. He split more logs than usual, stacking them high against the wall. He cleaned his rifle, though the sight of it made his stomach turn. He had promised himself never again to point a gun at another soul after the night his daughter died. Yet the thought of losing these girls to the cruelty of men twisted something deeper than his vow. One night, as he worked the whetstone against his knife, Nayeli came to sit across from him. She said nothing for a long while, only watched the blade glint in the firelight. Then softly, "You, stay for us?" Her voice carried more weight than the words themselves. Ethan looked up, meeting her gaze. He could not answer with promises he wasn't sure he could keep, but the truth rose in him anyway. "I stay," he said. Her lips curved into the faintest smile before she returned to her blanket. And Ethan realized then that the battle had already begun, not out there in Cold Creek, but in here, within these four walls. He was no longer fighting to survive alone. He was fighting to belong, to let them belong. The next morning, he saddled his mare and rode into town, head high, though his stomach churned. Cold Creek's main street fell silent when he appeared. He tied the reins outside Harlan's store and stepped onto the boardwalk, boots striking hard against the planks. Inside, the pastor himself stood waiting, flanked by two elders. Their faces were carved from stone, cold and certain. "McCord," the pastor said, "you know why we're here." Ethan's throat burned. Every instinct told him to turn, to walk away, to keep his head down. But he remembered Tiva's weak grip on his sleeve, Nayeli's calm smile, Ahioka's fierce stare. And he straightened his back. "They stay," he said simply. The pastor's lips thinned. The elders muttered. But Ethan didn't waver. He had made his choice, and though the storm was far from over, for the first time in years, Ethan McCord stood not as a broken widower, not as a man running from ghosts, but as a man willing to fight for the living. And as he rode home beneath the cold blue sky, the weight in his chest had shifted. It was still heavy, yes, but no longer hollow. Cold Creek had always been small, little more than a scatter of wooden buildings pressed against the wide New Mexico sky. But that morning, as Ethan McCord rode into town, it looked different, harder, meaner. The faces that turned toward him carried no welcome. He felt their eyes as he guided the mare down the street, the weight of judgment pressing heavy as the saddle on his shoulders. Behind him rode a sight the town had never seen. 3 Apache girls. Ahioka sat tall despite her bandaged shoulder, her chin raised in fierce defiance. Nayeli rode with quiet grace, her hand steady on the reins, though her limp made each movement cautious. Tiva clung to her sister, fragile but determined, her dark eyes wide as she took in the town. Together, they were not a threat, not an army, only 3 survivors. Yet in Cold Creek, their presence was enough to stir whispers like a rising wind. Ethan had thought long on this ride. He could have come alone. He could have kept them hidden, safe within the cabin walls. But safety, he'd realized, was an illusion. The town's whispers had already made them guilty. Better, then, to face the fire head-on than to let it burn unseen. He dismounted before the church, helping Tiva down with careful hands. The crowd was gathering, drawn by the spectacle. The pastor himself stepped onto the steps, his black coat flaring in the morning breeze. Reverend Caldwell's face was carved with pious certainty, his voice carrying across the street. "Ethan McCord," he called, "you bring shame upon this town." The words struck harder than a fist, but Ethan forced himself to stand tall. He had heard shame before. He had worn it like a second skin after burying his wife and daughter, after failing them. But this time, it was not his to carry. "They are under my roof," Ethan said, his voice steady. "They bleed the same as any of us. I won't turn them out to die." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded grimly, others spat in the dust. One man shouted, "They don't belong here. They'll bring war to our doors." Ahioka's jaw tightened, but she said nothing, her dark gaze fixed on the man as if daring him to repeat the words. Nayeli shifted closer to Ethan, her presence a calm anchor. Tiva clutched his sleeve, trembling but unyielding. Reverend Caldwell lifted a hand for silence. "This is not about survival," he intoned. It is about morality. A Christian town cannot abide such. Corruption. A widower taking 3 heathen women into his house? You shame your wife's grave. McCord. Ethan's throat tightened. For a heartbeat, he saw Lucy's small grave by the cottonwoods, his wife's pale face as they lowered her into the earth. The old guilt surged, sharp and merciless. But then Tiva's grip tightened on his sleeve, small fingers clutching with all the strength of a girl who had clung to life in the snow. He looked at her, at the fear in her eyes, and something inside him hardened. "My wife is gone," he said, his voice low but carrying. "My daughter, too. Shame took them, and it near took me. But these 3," he gestured to the girls beside him, "they're alive because I found them, because I chose not to walk away. If that is shame, then I'll wear it gladly." The crowd erupted. Some jeered, some turned away, but just a few stood silent, their faces unreadable. Old Mr. Henderson, the rancher with more years than teeth, tipped his hat slightly, a gesture Ethan did not miss. Caldwell's face flushed red. "You defy the word of God for the sake of your pride?" Ethan stepped forward, his boots grinding in the dust. "No, I defy you. You think God's word is hate, but I don't. You think decency means turning your back, but I don't. I won't let them die so you can feel righteous." For a moment, silence hung heavy, broken only by the creak of the sign above the store. The crowd shifted, uneasy. The spell of the pastor's words wavered, if only for a heartbeat. Then Sheriff Denton pushed through the gathering. He was a broad man, weary eyes set deep beneath his hat. He looked at Ethan, then at the girls, then back to the crowd. His voice was quieter, but it carried. "Law says a man can give shelter on his own land. Ain't against the books, but," his gaze held Ethan's, "it makes enemies. You best be ready for that." Ethan met his eyes, felt the warning behind them. Then he nodded. "I've been ready since the storm." Caldwell sputtered, but the sheriff raised a hand. "Enough. If you've got a quarrel, take it up with me. For now, let the man be." The crowd broke slowly, like ice cracking on the river. Some left muttering, others cast one last glare before turning away. Only a handful lingered, uncertain. Henderson stepped closer, his old eyes narrowing at Ethan. "You've got grit, McCord," he said, "and grit needs a place to work. I could use another hand on my ranch, if you're willing." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. He inclined his head. "I'll think on it." By the time the sun dipped low, Ethan rode out of Cold Creek with the girls at his side. The town still stood behind him, bristling with judgment and threat. But something had shifted. He had not hidden. He had not bent. That night, back in the cabin, the girls sat close to the fire, silent but watchful. Ethan set his rifle across his knees, staring into the flames. The fear was still there, fear of what Caldwell might stir, of what the town might do, but beneath it ran something steadier. For the first time in years, Ethan McCord felt he had stood for something more than his own survival. He had stood for them. And as the girls leaned against one another, drifting into uneasy sleep, Ethan swore to himself that no matter what storm came next, be it snow, or hate, or the sharpened tongues of Cold Creek, he would not bend again. Spring had finally broken the land free of its white grip. Wildflowers crept along the ridges, purple and yellow against the thawed earth, and with them came the annual town dance. For most, it was an evening of fiddles and laughter. For Ethan McCord, it was a reckoning. The invitation had not come to him, of course, but word spread. He knew Reverend Caldwell would be there, and Harlan, and every family who had whispered shame on his name. He could have stayed away. He nearly did. But as he sat on the porch, watching a Hyoka practice steps in the dirt with her younger sisters, he felt the decision settle in his chest. They had hidden long enough. On Saturday evening, he dressed in his best shirt, one Nayeli had mended with steady hands. The girls wore plain dresses cut from fabric he'd bought with the last of his savings. Nothing fancy yet when they stood beside him, firelight catching their dark hair. Ethan thought no finery in the world could match them. The town hall doors creaked as they stepped inside. Conversation faltered, then stilled altogether. Faces turned, some twisted in disgust, others merely stared. Ethan felt the heat of every gaze, but lifted his chin. His heart thundered, but he kept his stride even, guiding Tiva's steps with his hand. Caldwell was there, lips pressed thin. Harlan muttered to his wife, loud enough for Ethan to hear. Shameless. But amid the glares came something else, a nod from Henderson, the rancher who had offered him work. A smile, small but genuine, from a young mother whose child Nayeli had tended weeks before. Cracks in the wall of hate. The fiddle struck up. Ethan hesitated, stiff as oak. He had never been a graceful dancer, and with so many eyes waiting for him to falter, fear pressed heavy. But Nayeli's hand found his, warm and steady. Her gaze said what words could not. You are not alone. He led her onto the floor. The music swelled, boots tapping, skirts swishing. They moved awkwardly at first, Ethan stepping too heavy, Nayeli limping slightly. Yet as the tune quickened, something shifted. He no longer heard whispers, no longer felt the sting of Caldwell's glare. Only the rhythm, and the girl at his side refusing to shrink. At the edge, Ahioka stood guard, chin high, daring anyone to sneer aloud. Tiva clapped in time, her laugh ringing like chimes. And for the first time in years, Ethan laughed too rough, short, but real. They danced not for approval, but for defiance, for life, for the family they had chosen in spite of everything. When the music ended, silence held for a breath. Then Henderson clapped, slow but firm. Others followed. Not all, not many, but enough. And in that fragile applause, Ethan felt something crack open wider than any storm could tear. He had not won them all. He never would. But tonight, in the heart of Cold Creek, Ethan McCord stood not as a widower with ghosts, but as a man with a family. And that was enough. The prairie wore spring like a new dress wildflowers, stretching toward the sun, the creek alive with meltwater. For weeks after the dance, life settled into a rhythm Ethan had never dared imagine. He rose with the dawn to work Henderson's cattle, returned each evening to the glow of lamplight in the cabin, to the sound of voices waiting for him. Ahioka took charge of the small garden, her stubbornness turning soil into neat rows of beans and squash. Nayeli baked bread with steady patience, the cabin filling with scents Ethan hadn't smelled since his wife's days. And Tiva, though still frail, had grown stronger. Her laughter, once rare, now threaded through the evenings like music. Cold Creek had not changed overnight. Caldwell still glared from his pulpit, and Harlan still overcharged him at the store. Yet something had shifted. Henderson stopped by often, leaving seed or tools on the porch. The blacksmith nodded when they passed. Even the sheriff, worn and weary, tipped his hat one morning and said only, "Keep 'em safe, McCord." That night, Ethan sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees. Not as a threat, but as a habit. The stars burned clear overhead, and the girl's laughter drifted from inside. He felt the ache of memory, his wife's soft hands, his daughter's voice, but the ache no longer hollowed him. It steadied him. Ahioka stepped out, crossing her arms. "You guard too much," she said, her English improving, sharp as her gaze. Ethan almost smiled. Maybe, but a man guards what he can't bear to lose. For a long moment, they stood together in silence. Then Nayeli called from the doorway, teasing, and Tiva's giggle followed. Ahioka's stern expression softened. Ethan looked at them, three girls, who had come from the snow, from blood and silence, and felt the truth settle deep. They were not ghosts. They were not burdens. They were his. The wind moved gentle through the grass. The cabin glowed behind him, warm against the dark. For the first time in years, Ethan McCord believed the future could hold more than sorrow. Not a perfect family, not one chosen by blood, but one chosen by survival, by defiance, by love. A family strong enough to face whatever storms might come. And as the night deepened, Ethan whispered into the quiet more to himself than to God, "We're still standing." The image that lingers is simple. A weathered rancher sitting on his porch, the prairie quiet around him, and three young women inside his cabin, their laughter spilling into the night. After storms of snow, whispers of judgment, and the shadows of grief, Ethan McCord found himself no longer alone. What began as a desperate act of mercy, dragging three wounded Apache girls from the frozen dark, became the slow, painful work of choosing love and defiance over silence and shame. Across 11 chapters, we watched him wrestle with ghosts from his past and the scorn of his neighbors. The town saw corruption, scandal, even betrayal. But Ethan saw something else: human beings worth saving. In those moments when his hands stitched wounds, when he listened to their fragile songs by the fire, or when he faced a crowd with nothing but truth, he was reclaiming his own broken dignity. And isn't that a lesson we all recognize? That life rarely gives us perfect families, perfect neighbors, or perfect endings, but it does give us chances to stand for what matters, even when the cost is high. For those of us who have lived long enough to carry regrets, this story is a reminder that redemption often arrives quietly, not in grand victories, but in small choices. Staying when it would be easier to walk away, protecting those who cannot protect themselves, finding hope again after loss. Perhaps you've known a season where others judged too harshly, or where grief made you shut the door. Ethan's journey tells us it is never too late to open that door again, to let light and laughter back in. So tonight, let this tale rest in your heart. Reflect on the truth that family is not always written in bloodlines, but often in courage, sacrifice, and the will to keep standing together. And if this story touched something in you, consider passing that warmth along, share it with someone who may need it, leave a kind word, and, if you wish, support this channel with a like, a share, or a subscription. Because sometimes, what keeps us all standing is not the storms we endure, but the stories we choose to carry forward.